In this episode, I am going to be interviewing writer J.R. Jordan about his book, Robert Wise, The Motion Pictures. And we are also going to be reviewing a film that Robert Wise directed, personal favorite of mine, Somebody Up There Likes Me, from 1956. This starred Paul Newman and Pier Angeli, and it was written by Ernest Lehman. Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore movies from all over the world and talk about how those stories were told on film. I want to welcome very special guest today, Joe Jordan, who is a motion picture historian and is the author of Showmanship, The Cinema of William Castle, and Robert Wise, The Motion Pictures, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Joe, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to see you, Robert. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I've been really enjoying the book. I think this is a great treasure, not just for Robert Wise fans, but for film fans in general, because of how versatile Robert Wise was. And not only as a director, but as he edited Citizen Kane. Like, this guy, it's like you go down his filmography and it's like unbelievable. Which I'll certainly get into. But I wanted to ask off the top, I know you had mentioned that you got interested in Robert Wise after seeing The Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen with your father, and that connection with your dad really got you interested in Wise in general. But was there something else about the man or his films, or a combination of the two, that made you really want to explore this as a book?
Absolutely. So it was the filmography. When I looked at Robert Wise's filmography for the first time, I was amazed at the variety. So many different genres. There's horror, there's war, there's musicals, of course. Who can forget, or who can how can you not mention The Sound of Music or West Side Story when talking about Robert Wise? Sci-fi, so many different genres, and so that's what did it for me. But of course, that screening of The Sand Pebbles, that was the catalyst, I guess you could say, that got my interest, that boosted my interest in Robert Wise.
And why a critical analysis as opposed to a biography? Why did you feel that was more important, so to speak?
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to write a book similar to one I had read when I was in college. Back many, many years ago, I took a summer course pertaining to the films of Alfred Hitchcock. And the professor specifically chose a book that was more about the films and less about the man. So this book had a chapter for almost every single Hitchcock film. I think the first chapter was entitled Early Silent Films. Then there was a chapter for blackmail, and then some of the early sound films. And then once you got around to Rebecca, there was pretty much a chapter for every Alfred Hitchcock film, all the way up to Family Plot. And so that book really impressed me, and I wanted to kind of do something like that. Let's say somebody is spending a weekend at home and they have some Robert Wise films on DVD. I'd like to think that my book would serve as the ideal Robert Wise companion. During the pandemic, so many people were staying home and watching films. If you have a Robert Wise marathon going on, and if you happen to have my book in close proximity, I'd like to think that it goes a long way. It just makes the viewing experience more worthwhile.
Yeah, I totally agree, because that's what I like so much about the book, is that if you're going to read this book, you have to watch the movies, because it encourages the viewer to go and seek them out. I mean, like you said, most people know The Sound of Music, they know West Side Story, but then you go through his filmography and he did every genre, not only every genre, but like at the classics of so many genres: film noir, boxing films. I mean, boxing / noir with the setup. It's horror, like so many genres, so many different styles. And you can't if you're gonna read the book and not know the films, it's kind of impossible to get invested in the book. Like you have to. So I think it's clever on that one hand, because it's like, hey, go watch these movies as a, because I mean, I love biographies, I love memoirs, I love autobiographies, but I could read a Robert Wise biography and just want to know about him and not need to go see the movies. Whereas I find this, you have to go see the movies, which is what's so great about it. I love that about the book.
Yeah, I will admit there have been some people who were disappointed, and they purchased the book with the intention of it. They expected it to be a biography, maybe to be a little gossipy as well. And when they realized it wasn't really any of that, it was kind of a letdown for them. So
yeah, I noticed some comments online, but saying things like that, but I can understand that, because people really eat up, like look at a director like Nicholas Ray, like his biography is full of drama. I mean, he was a great filmmaker as well, but he has a lot of juicy stories. But I think, again, for anyone who hasn't read this book, if you're a film buff or a cinephile or just interested in classic Hollywood, this is not just an insight into this director, but a guy who did everything, editing, like I said, every single genre. So it's incredible. Was there any biographical details on Wise that you found the most interesting?
So I think out of all the interviews I conducted, and I conducted, gosh, over 20 interviews, I would have to say that his nephew, Douglas E. Wise, provided some really good insight. So Douglas E. Wise was actually a first assistant director in the industry for many years, and he actually was a director for some television episodes as well. When he was first getting started, Robert Wise was directing Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and so as it turns out, he selected his nephew to be one of the ADs for that film. And the things that he was able to tell me about his uncle, he actually wrote the introduction for the book. But I think what he was able to tell me really summed it up. Almost everybody had nothing but positive things to say about Robert Wise. There were one or two people who spoke their mind and, were, I guess you could say, brutally honest. But everything that Douglas Wise said to me, it pretty much summed up what everybody else was trying to tell me. During the production of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, it was difficult because the studio decided to begin shooting without a completed script. It had been pre-booked in theaters in order to provide an extra source of revenue. So Paramount is facing this, release date, but then while the film was being produced, problems would come up on a day-to-day basis. Doug Wise told me that he received so many revisions to the script that it became necessary for him to label these revisions with the day and the time that he received them. And even if an actor would claim that he or she wasn't receiving these revisions, Doug Wise was able to take their call sheets, staple the changes to their sheets, and then whenever he handed a revision, a change to any of the, principal actors for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, he would always get them to sign it. So that way, if anybody claimed any wrongdoing, if they said, hey, look, you never gave me these changes, he had the proof, right then and there. But what he was trying to tell me about his uncle was that, Robert Wise had no time to prepare because these changes were constantly taking place and he had to do things on the fly. But that's where his experience came in handy. He was able to choreograph the scenes despite not having enough time to think things through. You probably know all about the storyboards. When he was directing a lot of those early pictures, he relied on storyboards. And same thing with Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Even though it was towards the end of his career, he was still able to rely on the previous experience he had with arranging all of his shots on his storyboards. And I think maybe I'm a little biased, but I think because of Robert Wise, the Star Trek film series was launched. It paved the way for many more exciting films to come, all because of the motion picture. I think Robert Wise was an integral part of, getting that franchise started.
Well, that's what's so interesting about Wise was the fact that he started as an editor, and you talk about this in the book with you. Not only was he an editor, but he was also an editor at RKO, where they were very, conscious of the budget and staying within budget. So I can imagine that starting as an editor, he then would be able to work backwards as a director and already piece it together before he would go and direct it, and also know what he wanted and how it would look, so that he wouldn't, perhaps do more takes or try to experiment in the editing. I'm not saying anything's wrong with that, because there are many directors who do wonderful films that way. But I'm always fascinated by these filmmakers who know the medium inside and out and are able to see the film in their head and piece it together before they even go on set. And you mentioned Hitchcock earlier. Hitchcock was like that too. I mean, it was like down to a T what he would shoot was how it was storyboarded. So I imagine it was from his editing experience. I can't see where else he would have learned that.
One of the people I interviewed told me that he actually recorded notes onto the shooting scripts of his film. So like, let's say it's the principal photography phase of the film, and they're, on the soundstage or on location, whatever. Robert Wise would actually record notes onto the shooting scripts of his films. So that way, when the post-production crews took over, they could take that actual script and take a look at Robert Wise's
oh wow
notes.
and just follow the instructions, I suppose.
Yeah, he was being economical. He preferred not to shoot that extra footage if the opportunity ever presented itself. He knew exactly what was needed when the time came for the editors to cut the film, primarily because he was an editor himself.
Yeah. No, I find that really, really fascinating. Who was the most helpful with the book? I know you mentioned you interviewed 20 people. Was there someone that really you got the most insight from, or was it just everybody?
Well, I'd say Gavin MacLeod. Gavin MacLeod, out of everybody I spoke with, Doug Wise, being Robert Wise's nephew, that was an invaluable resource. But Gavin MacLeod spoke of Robert Wise like a father. Gavin lost his father at an early age, and so he saw Robert Wise as kind of like a father figure. And when I asked him, our interview went so well that a short time following the interview, I had asked Gavin MacLeod if he would be interested in writing the foreword, and immediately he said it would be an honor.
Yeah.
So I would have to say, yes, that was probably the greatest contribution. They were all, for the most part, great, but Gavin MacLeod's really stands out above the others, I think.
His forward was so touching. I mean, I love the story of working on I Want to Live with Susan Hayward. Yeah. And, that's a film that I have only seen a little bit of, and I have to see it because I remember seeing just a portion of it, I think on TCM many years ago. And it's just, it's one of those things, I just haven't seen it. And I love the story about, he was worried about tugging on her hair because, she was a big star. Yeah. And then she told him, no, you got to pull my hair because I might get an Oscar out of this. But just how he loved Wise so much, and like to actually give him an award on stage and say like he was like, like a father to me, or a father I wanted. That's quite moving. What do you think it was about him that made him so good with actors?
Robert Wise was the type of person who he didn't alienate others. He was just very fair. He was firm but fair. And I think, if you take a look at some of the other people in the industry, some of the other directors, they're notorious for being the opposite of that.
Right.
What it came down to, I think, was just his approachability. He was very approachable. Even when he was working on The Sound of Music with so many young children, he still was able to he still found a way to make his point. Heather Menzies-Urich, who played Louisa Von Trapp, she had explained to me during our conversation that there were times where he would be firm, but it wasn't to the point where he scared anybody. You know,
Right.
that the children immediately understood he meant business, and because they respected him, he was able to get the job done.
I find that really fascinating, and actually, that was a great thing to discover in the book, that he was so kind and he was so generous and as you said, fair. And I love the fact that people loved working with him and would do it again at the drop of a hat. Did his nephew or anyone talked about how why his temperament was so, why he was so kind? Was there anything about his upbringing that came up that maybe there were some clues as to why he was that way?
Not necessarily, just that he had a good relationship with his older brother, and the relationship was so strong that Robert Wise, went out west, moved from Indiana to Hollywood to join his brother who was working at RKO.
You also mentioned his great speech, the AFI tribute in 1998. I mean, he's so humble, and I know you quoted him when he said, if I've got a script from, like in this film we're talking about today, Lehman, from a lot of these great writers, he's like, hey, I wanted to do the best I could to basically tell the story and he felt as if he owed it to them. It's like, the fact that they gave him these great stories, he wanted to do whatever he could and his creative powers. And I like that he also in that speech made an emphasis on the collaboration, because I think sometimes the auteur theory gets it gets way blown out of proportion, and I think some directors have sort of jumped onto that and given the impression that they basically do everything, which is like the furthest thing from the truth. And it was great to see a guy of his stature thank his collaborators and emphasize that these projects were a collaboration, and as opposed to it being about him or some kind of signature style or something that popped out to you as this is Robert Wise. So I really like that. I really like that about him, or anyone in general. We touched on this already, but like what I find so fascinating about him, not only was he versatile, like we said, musicals, film noir, boxing films, horror. He did everything. Edited Citizen Kane, and some of the best war films, or anti-war films. But yet, what's no one necessarily knows that, oh yeah, this is a Robert Wise film. Like, he's not someone who is discussed as much as someone like Hitchcock or other Preminger, other Nick Ray, other directors back then. And what's fascinating to me is not only was he versatile, but these are like the best of the best. Like The Haunting to me is one of the best classic horror films. The Setup, like, and Somebody Up There Likes Me. These it's not just, yeah, he made a boxing film, he made one of the best ones, one of the best musicals. Was there any indication as to why scholars and such don't talk about him as much? Like, why are there not 100 books on this guy? I mean, is there any clues about that?
Well, I'd like to think that at some point, whether it's 20 years from now or 50 years from now or 100 years from now, that Robert Wise will receive much more attention than he has thus far. He was not an auteur. He was more of like a craftsman, he let the script basically dictate the pace of the film.
Right.
Themes would basically emerge as the film progressed, as the production of the film progressed. I think everything started with Orson Welles, and had it not been for Wise's collaboration with Orson Welles, who knows where his career would have gone. Orson Welles was the kind of guy who had high expectations, and when Wise became an editor on Citizen Kane, he had to work hard. He had to make sure, hey, look, I can't let this guy down.
Right.
If anybody expected to work for Mr. Welles, they had to know their stuff, no doubt about it. Editing is an incredibly challenging profession. I think what a lot of people who are not in the industry don't realize is that editing is one of the toughest components of a film. And to be an editor of
Oh yeah.
Citizen Kane, arguably the greatest motion picture of all time, not an easy task, but Robert Wise made it happen. He made it work. So then Welles was so impressed that he hired Wise to be an editor of his next picture, The Magnificent Ambersons. So then at one point during the production of The Magnificent Ambersons, Welles took off for Brazil. It was in the middle of production of Magnificent Ambersons. He just kind of went to Brazil to work on another project. And then Wise was suddenly called upon to direct part of The Magnificent Ambersons. He gained a lot of experience. It was a small scene, but Robert Wise, I think, just with that episode of his life, gained so much experience. So then a couple years later, when The Curse of the Cat People commenced production, Gunther von Fritsch was tapped to direct that film. But he wasn't mindful of the shooting schedule. Production went, down the tubes. They fell behind, and as a result, the film went over budget. So von Fritsch was let go, and Val Lewton, actually decided to take a chance on Robert Wise and say, "Hey, why don't you direct, the rest of this picture, The Curse of the Cat People?" And so the following years were promising. I think Val Lewton basically nurtured Robert Wise during those RKO years.
Right.
Eventually, Robert Wise departed RKO for 20th Century Fox, but he never forgot that impact that Val Lewton had on him. And you mentioned The Haunting, which is one of Wise's most successful pictures. And The Haunting is actually dedicated to Val Lewton's memory.
Oh, is that in the credits? I must have missed that.
I don't believe it's in the earlier versions now.
Okay. One thing about Wise that's fascinating that hadn't, he explored some tough issues like racism and Odds Against Tomorrow, and he did war films, anti-war films. We touched on The Haunting. Claire Bloom's character, it's quite highly suggested that she's gay. Did his politics ever come up in your research? Was he's looking at his films, he speaks to me as progressively minded.
Yes. So absolutely. The one thing I want to touch on is his opposition to the Vietnam War.
Right.
Now, The Sand Pebbles was produced in '65. Just a year earlier, LBJ, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had passed. And so American combat troops were starting to fight a ground war in Vietnam. And so while that ground war was getting underway with the United States involvement, Robert Wise was in Taiwan filming The Sand Pebbles. It was an early stage of American involvement in the Vietnam War, but Robert Wise still had a gut feeling that it was not a very good thing to get involved with. And by 1968, LBJ had escalated the war. And so a lot of people in domestic America were catching on, and a lot of protests, But I think Robert Wise knew from the get-go that it was just not a good idea. And then in the 70s, he and Mark Robeson, a good friend of his, Mark Robeson, they formed an independent production company. And one of the films they produced was called Two People, that Robert Wise actually directed. It starred Lindsay Wagner and Peter Fonda.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but it looks interesting.
It's worth watching.
I'll have to see it.
Peter Fonda's character is that of a draft dodger. He goes all the way to Morocco, and they have to. The MP, or actually a representative of the United States government, goes to bring him back to the United States. But yeah, Robert Wise made it very clear that he was against the Vietnam War. Jimmy Stewart, on the other hand, you and I are both big fans of Alfred Hitchcock, and he appeared in 4 Hitchcock films.
Right.
Jimmy Stewart was the opposite.
Yeah, that's right.
He referred to the Vietnam War as mismanaged but necessary.
Right.
But going back to Robert Wise, yeah, I think that's probably the greatest thing I discovered, is that he was a pacifist, and he believed we had no business being over there, and that he knew that before it escalated, before it got out of control. So,
how long did you work on the book? How long did the book take?
So I started my research in 2014, and the first edition came out in 2017. But then between 2017 and 2020, I was able to include more interviews and include more information. So the revised edition came out in 2020. So overall, 6 years.
Jumping into Somebody Up There Likes Me, when did you first see this film?
That was one of the early films that I saw. So I had seen the setup. And so after I had seen and written about the setup, I knew that I wanted to watch Somebody Up There Likes Me, just because that's his other boxing drama. And Robert Wise, I think, after directing the setup, he kind of had that urge to do another boxing film, which depicts the real life story of Rocky Graziano, who was the former middleweight boxing champion of the world. And you mentioned Ernest Lehman earlier, and Ernest Lehman was hired by the studio to write the script of Somebody Up There Likes Me. They gave him Graziano's autobiography, and Ernest Lehman devoured it and loved it. But he wanted to take his research a step further, and so he actually interviewed some of Graziano's friends and family, so that way the script would be right on, as accurate as possible. As far as casting for Somebody Up There Likes Me is concerned, MGM wanted James Dean for Graziano, and I think James Dean probably would have turned in a phenomenal performance. Tragically, he was killed on September 30th of 1955, and so it kind of altered the course of the film's production. Nevertheless, Wise and the studio, they discovered Paul Newman. He was an up-and-coming actor. He was on loan from Warner Brothers. And I think Paul Newman turned out to be an outstanding choice for Graziano.
Yeah, I agree. I saw a biography on Newman years ago, and I believe once James Dean died, he asked for the part. I don't know if that came up in any research you did. I believe he actually went and said, can I have this?
Yeah, that might be right, because I did talk to Neil Adams. Neil Adams, the widow of Steve McQueen.
Oh, yeah, his first wife.
Yes, and she told me that because Steve McQueen was offered a small part in Somebody Up There Likes Me, and so she was able to kind of learn a thing or two about what was going on behind the scenes. And she did touch upon that, and she said that the part was given to Paul Newman because of his connection to the Actors Studio. She doesn't believe that anybody else actually auditioned for that role of Rocky Graziano. They wanted to have James Dean. He was killed in the car accident, and so I believe, yes, it was just given to Paul Newman. He didn't audition.
Do you think the connection with the Actors Studio was because, in the 50s, because of Brando and Dean and a lot of actors, because that was so popular, they were like, okay, well, maybe we should get someone who's also part of that training, that school?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
And this was like a make or break for Paul, I believe, or maybe he felt that way because the Silver Chalice had tanked, and I haven't seen it, but I've heard it's terrible. Newman said it's terrible. I think it was shown on TV at one point, and he put out an ad like apologizing for how bad it was. So, Hollywood doesn't give you a lot of chances, right? So this was somewhat of a make or break perhaps in his film career. But I agree with you. I think he gave a remarkable performance, and I know some critics have felt that he wasn't convincing as an Italian American, but I think that only goes as far as his looks. I mean, yeah, sure, he doesn't look Italian American. When the film starts, I am like, oh, okay, aware, okay, it's Paul Newman, like it stands out as Newman. But once the film gets going, I get so invested in not like seeing Paul Newman the movie star, but seeing Rocky Graziano, because I thought he had the accent down perfectly. I felt he found the guy's hatred and anger in the early parts of the film was so real, so spontaneous, and also the sense of humor, because the film has a lot of great organic humor. And I think that Newman was effortless in his timing, his commitment to the park, even his shyness with Pier Angeli when he first starts going out with her. He's got this innocent, boyish quality. Like, it's a wide range of feelings and behavior. And I honestly, if it wasn't for his looks, I think people would talk about this film more now. Because when we think Newman, we think The Hustler, The Verdict, Color of Money, that he was perfect for, not only for his acting but for his appearance. Whereas this film, yeah, he's not convincing because of the way he looks, but the acting and the like I said, the mannerisms, everything is remarkable. Like, I just think he was so good in this film.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the supporting characters are equally important.
Yeah, I agree.
And I have to agree with you. I have to agree with you that, as you start watching Somebody Up There Likes Me, even though Paul Newman is not Italian, he still is able to nail that role so well. It's believable. It's believable.
It really, really is. You mentioned the supporting cast. When I watched it again yesterday, I've seen it a number of times, but one performance that really blew me away was it's either Eileen Heckart or Eileen, who played his mother, Ma Barbella. The scene, particularly where she goes to prison to visit him, and she says that she's ready to give up on him if he keeps winding up in jail, and just the tears in her eyes, and then he begins to weep because he feels that he's letting his mother down. I thought she was so good in that, in this film, as this mother who didn't want to give up on her son, and actually was a big part of the reason why he tried to be a better person, and try to, as he said, turn the other leaf, try to make it in the legit world. I love the way he put things. I thought that character and that performance was so incredible. Everybody was who are some of the other standouts for you?
So Harold J. Stone plays Graziano's father, Nick Barbella.
He was great too.
And, Wise doesn't really waste any time introducing that character. Following the opening credits, you're in the crowded apartment of the Graziano residence. There's a boxing lesson, a so-called boxing lesson that's taking place. Nick is, boxing with his young son. Young Graziano has tears in his eyes, and he's basically taking a beating at the hands of his father.
Right.
The following scene, Wise transitions to the exterior of a drugstore. Displayed in the window, it's an advertisement for razor blade. Gene Tunney, a cardboard cutout of Gene Tunney, who was the world heavyweight champion of the era. And there's this advertisement that is promoting the razor blades. And so in this fit of anger, you've got this young Rocky Graziano. He's just thinking about his abusive father. He just breaks the window. And that one lone action of breaking the window of the drugstore begins this years-long crime spree. But, later in the narrative, Wise brings us back to that very same location outside of the drugstore. And again, displayed in the window, you've got this advertisement for razor blades, but now instead of Tunney, it's the adult Rocky Graziano, who's the cardboard cutout. And so I think what Robert Wise is trying to tell us is that, so much has transpired through the years. And then after Graziano looks at the cardboard cutout of himself, he goes back up to that same apartment. He encounters his father. The two begin to argue. Graziano, he talks about how his dad doesn't follow through with, earlier aspirations of becoming a professional fighter. One thing leads to another, and the dad tries to strike, Rocky Graziano. It goes horribly, but then his dad starts to sob. Earlier he had told his young weeping son, "Hey, I hate crybabies," and here he is, showing his emotions. So then I think there's a turning point in the narrative in the film when Graziano assures his father that he's going to defeat Tony Zale. That's the big fight at the end of the film, the bout with Tony Zale. Says, "Don't worry about a thing." So Robert Wise sets up that final scene, that final bout between Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale. And the fight is interesting. It's entertaining, but the argument that I try to make in my book is that I think the transitions to people who are watching the fight, who are not in Chicago Stadium watching the fight, but elsewhere, I think those are really important. He goes to,
Yeah.
Robert Wise brings us into a crowded bar. He brings us to the, Graziano's Ocean Parkway home, the candy store of Graziano's old neighborhood. And so you're looking at three different characters in three different locations. And so this goes back to what I said earlier, that the supporting characters, I believe, are just as significant as the main character of Rocky Graziano.
What I liked, I was really glad that you wrote that in the book, and it hadn't dawned on me before, because that is such a turning point from the young Rocky breaking the window and seeing the cardboard cutout of the current middleweight champion. And then of course the irony is at the end, it's now he's the guy in the picture. And he, that scene in the beginning is so sad because he's basically getting abused by his father and humiliated in front of his father's friends, and they're all drinking, and his father was an alcoholic. And that was a big part of his rage, was his hatred for his father, and the fact that his father was abusive and not interested in him and pushed him around, and basically was a big reason that he was rebelling and breaking the law and turning to crime. You see them, they live in a very small tenement with, he also has a sister. And what I really popped out to me this time is that in the film, you see Graziano, his life gets so much better because of boxing. He had these different people encourage him to go into boxing and be a professional fighter. And I really like the scene where he gets blackmailed by Robert Loggia's character, and it's almost as if everyone now is trying to get him to go back to who he was, and it was hitting his insecurities. He finds out he's going to go to Chicago to face Tony Zale, and he gets mad. Like, I know you mentioned in the book, they hate me in Chicago. They were the ones in the press reporting that he's just scum. Look at him, he's a draft dodger. He was in prison. And what I used to always think was that, he didn't want that to get out because it was going to damage his career. But I think it goes deeper. I think he was humiliated by his past. He was embarrassed, that he was ashamed that he had turned to crime, and he didn't want that to get out, and it made him feel so insecure, and it scared him to think that it could possibly happen, again. And you also mentioned in the book that, his wife, Pier Angeli's character, says you have to learn how to live with your past, because he's always trying to run from it, escape it. And he, yes, your life is better now, but don't act like none of these things happened. And he goes back to Chicago. He leaves Chicago. He goes home. He sees a homeless person on the street. He sees Sal Mineo, who's, up to trying to do some illegal racket. And I think ultimately that scene with his father was so great, because he starts to get mad at him because his dad's being distant and won't shake his hand. And he's like, he tears into him, and then he says, look, you're just he says something along the lines of, you're just became a drunk, and you failed at boxing, and I have a chance to do something great. And then when his father breaks down and says, be a champ, I think that was ultimately what he always wanted, was for his dad to be proud of him, for his dad to love him and encourage him. And you mentioned this in the book as well. It's the only time in the film when he says, don't worry about it, which is something he says to everybody. But this time he says it with so much confidence. He's so self-assured, whereas before it was always like passive and dismissive, like, yeah, don't worry about it. And now he's like, Dad, don't worry about a thing. And ultimately, he goes and wins the title. And I think that the relationship with the father was so pivotal to why he turned to crime, and then why he was able to beat Tony Zale. I was curious if that was how you felt, if you felt any differently about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, the fight with Graziano and Zale, it's intriguing, but as somebody viewing the film for the first time, I think I found myself more intrigued with the people who were watching the fight, whether it was Pier Angeli or whether it was the candy store proprietor, just because they also had such an impact on the life of Rocky Graziano.
Yeah. Do you think Wise was cutting there because it wasn't just about Rocky winning, but it was like he was winning for that whole neighborhood? It was almost like those people needed to see a positive influence. Like it was such a needed in this little Italy, where these people, I imagine, because of prejudice and different, they don't go into that in the film, but we're sort of pushed to the outskirts and lack of opportunity and things like that. They needed to see someone give some kind of a hope for the future for them. Do you think that's why he was doing that?
Yes, and one of the most powerful images of the film, in my opinion, is during that fight between Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale. Robert Wise captures an image of the neighborhood, and everybody is indoors listening to the radio in anticipation of how the fight is going to turn out. You see an empty street, all these cars are parked, and that tells you a lot. Yeah, no, it's such a great moment. I love one thing. I remember Sal Mineo talking about when he says, come on, I bet $100 on you. But what I think I either forgot or I missed was that was the $100 that Rocky gave him right before, and he gave him money. But then the line actually is, I bet the $100 on you, I think. Or he says, I bet $100. And I realized, because gave him money, so he put the money down on him. I just thought that was really, really funny. But like I said, the film has a lot of great humor, because some of these jams that Rocky gets into, they are funny. They're somewhat funny, like particularly when he goes into the army. Like here he is, he gets out of jail, he immediately gets drafted, and he's sleeping in, he's rebelling, he's they're talking to him like soldiers, and he's like, hey, knock it off, Mac. And then he threatens the one guy, punches the other sergeant in the face. And then runs away. And his idea to get out of this is to go back and bribe the guy. And so this is where all these boxing fights start. I mean, that was another aspect that I find appealing of him, was that he was innocent enough to think that he could bribe someone, that he could go back and bribe this guy for being a deserter. But I found myself laughing through a lot of these really bizarre situations he got himself to, particularly when he tells the guy who becomes his manager, at first he's like, hey, where did you box? And he's like, yeah, he lies and says he's boxed all around. And then he tells him, hey, make sure you go get a cup. And he thinks the guy means a cup to drink. He means a jock strap, right? He's like, don't worry, I'll drink it out of the bottle. It works on so many levels. And I never, my memory of this film was that it's perhaps it was too light, but I don't think so, because I think some of those situations, which are true, were just really bizarre. Like, I don't feel that they tried to just make it light or make it funny. Like, I think he got into these situations that are surreal, that are funny in a story. I mean, I don't know how you felt about the humor in the film. Yes, I agree with you 100%, especially when he goes into the army and just, striking a superior officer and thinking nothing of it. Yeah.
No, it's really, really wonderful. What do you think the story? I mean, if you had to, talk about the essence of the film, I mean, what do you think? Where do you think the heart of the film lies?
Pier Angeli, without a doubt. When you first see her character, you know, she's a friend of Rocky Graziano's sister. And you can tell that the sister is kind of trying to get the two of them
Yeah,
together.
right.
And, you know, for somebody who's seeing that film for the first time, you don't know if it's really going to turn out to be a successful relationship, unless maybe you saw the poster for the film ahead of time. But a lot of people might be quick to dismiss that character. And then, you know, she actually walks past the candy store, and there's that brief shot where she makes eye contact with Graziano. She keeps walking.
Yeah,
And so then you kind of have a feeling, wait a second, this is going to turn out, she's going to turn out to be one of the most important characters, if not the most important character. And what's interesting is that they have a daughter, and the performer who appears as Graziano's daughter is Angela Cartwright. And Angela Cartwright would later appear in The Sound of Music as Brigitte, one of
right.
the Seven Von Trapp children. But yeah, but going back to Pier Angeli, I think she is the heart and soul of the film.
Yeah, I agree because she understood him better than anyone. I feel like she had a real understanding of what he needed, like when he first loses against Tony Zale, and when he comes home, she's the one who knows how to egg him on, so to get that fire burning so that he'll do much better or win the next time. And like I said earlier, you know, telling him you need to live with your past, because he always looked also at as boxing as a bad thing, because, you know, where did these fists get him? In jail. And also he hated boxers because his father was a former boxer. So this the all these different inspirations he had. And then of course the guy I know you mentioned in prison, when the I forget the character's name, who witnesses that fight that he has outside, and then he encourages him to box. And something you pointed out that was interesting, that he just addresses him like a normal guy. He doesn't try to talk to him like a soldier or try to talk down at him. He just says, hey, you know, nice to meet you. And then you see actually how Rocky is appreciative of that. And that's such a great scene, because he gets him to see, like, yeah, maybe it's gotten you in trouble in life, but there's other ways. There's an alternative. You can do this professionally. You can, but he's, you know, you can understand with his background, Rocky, why he's wary of doing this. And but thank God there are these people, his mother as well, that had a profound influence on him, because as you find out, a lot of those in the early, a lot of his friends, they all like wound up in jail or dead or got the electric chair. And he's someone who had another chance, this special talent to do something really good with. And so sure, it's a rather simple story, and it's rather idealistic. It's, you know, right up Hollywood's alley, but it's so good. I mean, it's so emotional, and I think it's themes of perseverance and trying to do the right thing and trying to be a good person, as hard as it is for anyone, particularly a guy living in poverty who feels that his only option is crime. I think it has a really positive message. You know, I think it's a wonderful, you know, film. I know it's well known, but it's probably not as well known as, say, Raging Bull or Rocky, which is a shame, because I don't think there would be a Rocky or a Raging Bull without this. I don't know how you feel about that.
True. I think I if I had to choose between the setup and Somebody Up There Likes Me, I would choose the setup.
Me too. The setup's amazing, but it's a very different film. It's a very different boxing film. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately, Paul Newman was not even nominated for his performance.
That's right.
And I think he should have at least been nominated for his performance as Rocky Graziano.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Because like I said, even the way in which he reacted sometimes, so much was in his expression. For example, he has a professional fight. And then, of course, when this is when he was still running away from the army. And of course, it's for the army. The entire audience is the army. And I like how he's backstage and those two guys come in. They say, hey, you better come with us. And he thinks that it's they're arresting him. And no, it's not that anyone says anything that tells the audience that, even in the dialogue, it's all in his expression. Because his line is, yeah, I'll come with you. But he's so like defeated, he's like, oh, yeah, I'll come with you. And then when they say, yeah, we'll walk you to the ring, and then you see, he's like, oh no, they didn't recognize me. Like it's all in his behavior. Like and it's just in these subtle reactions. And then I was laughing later on when he misses the fight because he got into that argument with Pier Angeli, and he got caught in the rain, and he by the time he made up with her, it was too late to get to the fight. And then when he has to go up against the boxing commission, he's so embarrassed. Like before he starts talking, you see he's like, have you ever been in love? And I love what the guy says. He's like, you know what, this story must be true because it's so crazy. It's so corny that it's got to be true. There's no way you could have made that up. I agree. It's a wonderful, wonderful performance. One thing I noticed about the boxing scenes was that, because I know Scorsese, when he was doing Raging Bull and he watched a lot of boxing movies, he noticed that often the camera was outside the ring. But if you watch this, he wasn't talking about every single boxing movie, but he was saying generally speaking, if you notice in this film, the camera is right in the ring often. It's quite intimate. It's a POV shot of one fighter getting hit. So it's like he's, the fighter's is punching the camera. And if you look at Raging Bull, it really reminded me of those similar shots. Like the camera was right in those actors' faces, probably more so than in Somebody Up There Likes Me. But you can really see that in this film. I don't know if you saw a connection between the two.
Definitely.
Yeah. No, it's really really well done. Was there anything else about this film you wanted to mention?
Just that I think Pier Angeli is very, very important. Without her, I don't know if you'd really have much of a narrative. Sadly, she passed away in 1971. The young age of 39 from a barbiturate overdose. And she was actually I believe she had been cast in The Godfather.
You mentioned, I didn't know that. You mentioned that in the book. I wonder which part she was up for.
Yeah, I never found out. But yes, apparently that was going to be her next project. So
yeah, that's too bad because I've only seen her in a couple of things. I know her career didn't take off the way Newman's did, which was something you mentioned in the book, but she was really, really good in this. I thought that she had the sweetness, but also was tough at the same time. It could really match Newman. I thought their chemistry they were really playing off each other beautifully. I felt it's really, really wonderful.
Yeah.
I just wanted to lastly mention that you told this great story on Steve McQueen in this film, who I didn't know this was that he got into Pier Angeli's limousine and her husband at the time said, "Get out, this is my wife's limousine." He just said, "Oh yeah, no shit."
Yeah.
And he wouldn't leave, and then eventually he left. His part's quite small in this. Again, he's also, I don't know if he was, I don't think he was necessarily meant to be Italian American. I mean, because they could have, I know the Irish and Italians had conflict, right? So I'm not sure if he was playing necessarily Italian American, but it's great to see him in this before his stardom, before he sort of became McQueen, so to speak, because he had a very, as I'm sure you know, a style that was very on brand, so to speak, where he was so neutral and so cool and confident. That this is obviously before he started to have that kind of type. But you also talked to Joe Dante, right? Who was in this film, who played one of his friends.
Yes, Michael Dante. Yes,
Michael Dante, not Joe Dante.
He appears as Shorty the Greek,
One
of the four.
Yeah. Was he quite also? I from what he was saying in the book, he also loved Wise. But was there anything else about this experience that he spoke well of?
Well, he remembers that first day of filming when he first met Steve McQueen. They were at the Warwick Hotel, and they were going to take a limousine to the shooting location where they were shooting. And Steve McQueen pulls up on a motorcycle, and Michael Dante explains to him, if you'd like, you can leave your motorcycle in the hotel parking lot, and you can just ride in the limousine with us. And it was pouring rain, and Steve McQueen said, nope, I'm just going to follow along and I'll stay close to the limousine. And so on the way from the Warwick Hotel to the shooting location, I guess Michael Dante would turn around every so often to make sure that Steve McQueen was keeping up with them, because the rain was really intense that day. But sure enough, he was definitely able to keep up with them. Going back to my conversation with Neil Adams, one thing she had mentioned about the role of Rocky Graziano was that I guess Steve McQueen wanted to try out for the part of Rocky Graziano, and instead he was offered the smaller role.
That's right. Yeah.
So he and Paul Newman remained good friends, and sometimes Steve McQueen would say to Neil Adams, like, "I'm going to catch up with that dude someday," in regard to Paul Newman. I guess Paul was represented as a rebel type before Steve.
Right.
But Steve McQueen was notorious for saying, well, I was out stealing hubcaps while Paul Newman was still in college, for God's sake, But yeah.
They were always, I don't know if Paul was competitive with him, but it was quite obvious that McQueen was competitive with Paul. I read a biography on McQueen once, and I think someone had asked him for an autograph, and he said, "Hey, that's worth 10 Paul Newmans," or something like that. Yeah. Something along those lines. But at the same time, they did get along, right? It was not like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. Like they did, they were friends, right? Like they did have a good rapport. Was it easy to get in touch with a lot of these people, Mike Dante and Neil Adams, or how long did it take to get in touch with everyone?
Actually, the process, for the most part, it was quite smooth. I would just reach out to representatives, managers, agents, and the turnaround time wasn't too long at all.
That's good to know. Because I know sometimes that's the most challenging part, is just talking to the people who can give you, all your material. So that's really, really good to know. Well, Joe, thanks so much. I really appreciate that you took the time to come on to talk about the book.
Robert, could I just mention one more thing?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So you and I first came in contact because of Alfred Hitchcock. We met online, Facebook, because of an Alfred Hitchcock group. And I know recently that a quarterly publication was launched.
Yeah.
And in that publication, you wrote about Under Capricorn. I just wanted to give you a shout out. You did such a great job.
Thank you.
Your thoughts on that film. Under Capricorn, in my opinion, is very underrated. It came out during that transatlantic phase. And so a lot of people have dismissed it. So I thought it was refreshing, that you were able to write about it and find some great things to say about it. And so, thank you for, basically keeping the memory of that film alive, because a lot of people would like to forget it.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that you check that out, because that's a film that I also really, really liked. And I didn't know it either. I was asked to talk at the Alfred Hitchcock conference last year, HitchCon, and the gentleman Joel Guns, who ran HitchCon, he's also created this magazine, and he said the theme was how Hitch explored love on film. And when you think Hitchcock, you don't really think love stories, but his film had a lot of, actually very often were about love. And someone that I know who's a big Hitchcock fan, his name's George W. Sturts. He suggested Under Capricorn, and I hadn't seen it before, and I was like, wow, this is an amazing film that I think only in the last, I don't know, not that many years, people are starting to discover. It came out on Blu-ray. Kino Lorber put it out, so it's starting to kind of come around. 70 odd years later.
Yeah.
But thanks for reading that. I really appreciate that. And thanks again for coming on. It's this is an important book, and I think it's a great read. And as you said, it's a great companion to watching the Robert Wise films to get more of an insight into not only the man himself, but his filmmaking, how important he was in terms of developing the language of filmmaking as an editor and as a director. And this is a film, I have it here on DVD. It's a film that I've always really loved. So it was great. It was great chatting with you about this film and the book. So
Same here, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity.
yeah, thanks so much. And where is the best place for people to find the book? Is it available online pretty much anywhere?
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. My pen name is J.R. Jordan. So in order to find it, just type in J.R. Jordan and Robert Wise, and it should pop up.
Okay, great. And where's the best place for people to get in touch with you or read your other writings or your William Castle book?
Well, I'm not much of a social media person. I mean, I do have that Facebook account, which is how you and I were able to get in touch. But aside from that, I'm not much of a social media person. I used to have a website, but then I took it down. So usually people just reach out to the publisher if they need to get in touch with me. They'll send an email to the publisher, and then the publisher will forward it to me. So my email address is joe.jordan1973@gmail.com. And people can also reach out to me that way.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks again, Joe. And let's do it again. Let's do it again another time. Hope you can come again.
Absolutely. I would love that. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and or listening. If you are currently listening to this on the audio version of the podcast and you've run out of episodes to listen to, head over to the YouTube channel where every single episode that I've ever created can be found, youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. I also want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is bonus content that I create month in and month out. And it is based on polls that I put out at the beginning of every single month, which you, of course, as a member, will have access to vote on. So if you're interested in becoming a member and supporting me on Patreon, head over to the link for full details. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to my channel by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left in just a second. Just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes or when I go live. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.